Okay, bonjour. Today's lesson, we're going to be talking about les immeubles et, les appartements. So, les immeubles refer to usually apartment buildings, but sometimes a building in general, and apartment is an apartment. Okay, so for this video, you need just a few more vocabulary words. These aren't vocabulary words I'm going to have you make flashcards for, or that you will even be required to know on a test, but they're useful all the same. So, un immeuble, like I said, is an apartment building. Un appartement is an apartment. Un étage refers to a floor, like the number of floors in a building. First floor, second floor, that's un étage. Un ascenseur is an elevator. Un ascenseur. And lastly, la cour is can refer to either a courtyard or possibly a hallway, usually a courtyard though. Now, in order to talk about the floors of a building, we need to be able to say first, second, third, fourth, etc. These are called ordinal numbers because they go in an order, first, second, third, fourth. Okay, so creating ordinal numbers in French is actually way easier than it is in English. In English, we have to memorize first, second. That doesn't look anything like 1 or 2. Okay, third doesn't really look like 3. Right? And the endings are different. Fourth, fifth, sixth, most of them are th, but first, second, third, it's different. In French, it's almost all the same, okay? With the exception of the word for first. Okay, it has its own word and it can be either masculine or feminine. All the other ones don't change for masculine or feminine, but the word for first does. So étage is masculine, so most of the time you're going to be using premier with it. But if you're talking about, for example, your first class or first class on a train, it'd be première classe because classe is feminine. But when we're talking about floors, we're going to be looking at premier because étage is masculine. Okay, so all we really have to do to make these numbers into ordinal numbers, okay, is add em. All right, and you can see this in our last column. I've already written it in for you. You can see em, 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 em. Okay, it's the same over and over and over again. So we take the number 2, deux, and we add em, deuxième, trois, troisième, quatre, quatrième. Note that because quatre ended in an E, we dropped it to say fourth. Okay, so quatrième. Okay, cinq, cinquième. Because the Q is now in the middle of the word, we're going to add a U to the end. So that is one little exception. So we have a U here, cinquième, six, sixième, sept, septième, huit, huitième, neuf, neuvième. Now here the F changes to a V. Okay. Other than that, you can go on and on and on and on. Onzième, douzième, treizième, quatorzième, quinzième. Okay. You can go on and on and on. So really, really simple. The only thing you really have to remember is that in order to say first, you say premier or première. And then for quatre, we drop the E, or any other number that ends in the letter E, we drop it. For cinq, we add a U after the Q. And for neuf, we change the F to a V. Pretty simple. Now, culturally speaking, there is something very important that you need to know. So in English, if we take a look at this first picture of a house right here, we can see that it has 1, 2 floors, and we might call this a third floor. It might be an attic. We're not really sure. Okay, but it's at least a 2-floor house, a 2-story house. And we would call this the first floor and this the second floor. In French, what we call the first floor or the ground floor is called le rez-de-chaussée. Le rez-de-chaussée. And oftentimes you'll see this abbreviated as RDC, rez-de-chaussée. Okay, so the first floor, what we call the first floor, is called the rez-de-chaussée in France. That makes this floor le premier étage. We call it the second floor. They call it the first floor because they have a different word for the first floor. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you go to France and you're getting a hotel room and they say that you're au premier étage, that doesn't mean that you're on the first floor. It actually means that you're on the floor above it. And that's the same thing for subsequent floors. So if we were to count this one here, we would say le deuxième étage, le troisième étage, le quatrième étage, and it goes up from there. And this holds true for houses as well. So if you grow up, or if you live in a house that it just has a single floor, we call it a one-story home in English. In French, they would call it une maison sans étage. Okay, a house with no levels. It has no additional levels to it. Okay, if you do live in a two-story home, then you live in une maison à un étage. Okay, you have a house with an extra level, à un étage. If you have a three-story home, une maison à deux étages, and it goes on from there. When you live in an apartment building, you oftentimes need to tell people who are coming over which floor you live on. So if you live on the ground floor, you would say, j'habite au rez-de-chaussée. Okay, if you live on the ground floor, what we would call the first floor, j'habite au rez-de-chaussée. Now, if you're saying, we live on the third floor, remember, it's off a number, okay? Nous habitons au deuxième étage. Okay? And remember in English that even though that says second, in our minds, that's actually the third floor. All right? Here's just a little tidbit for you to think about. In France, and especially in Paris and other large cities like Lyon, most people live in apartments. Especially if they're living directly in the city, they're living in an apartment as opposed to a house. And because these buildings are very, very old, some buildings dating back to the 16th century maybe, or even earlier sometimes, there weren't any elevators. Now, some older buildings have installed elevators, but a lot of them still don't have an elevator. And so that's something to keep in mind. For example, if you go to Paris and you get a hotel room, if they give you a room and they say that it's au deuxième étage, and if they don't have an elevator, you might think, oh, 2 floors, that's not too bad. I can haul my luggage up 2 floors. But it's actually 3 floors. Au deuxième étage, we would call that the third floor. Okay, that's where I'm going to leave you. I'm going to say bonne chance. And I will see you next time.